Welcome to our conversation on cellular energy. We gain cellular energy through two main processes, respiration and photosynthesis. Respiration is how we get energy from chemical energy in our foods and use it to fuel our metabolism. In this image, you can see runners of the Raramuri from Chihuahua, Mexico. The Raramuri are known to be incredible long-distance athletes. They're also known to run in huaraches, special sandals. This footwear has spawned a lot of different trends in long-distance running. The incredible running abilities of the Raramuri and peoples all around the world is a celebration of respiration and energy use, fueling our metabolisms. But how do we get that energy? And how does energy go from sunlight to organisms like us? Let's look at how that process occurs. Remember that energy flows through an ecosystem. That energy begins as light energy and is turned into chemical energy by producers like grass. Once that energy is available, consumers, in this case a grasshopper, will eat the grass and release that chemical energy. That energy will then be used to fuel the growth and metabolism of the grasshopper. Other organisms can then eat primary consumers and again release the energy contained in their tissues. We call these secondary and tertiary consumers. When organisms at any stage in this process die, their mass is broken down by decomposers like fungi. This makes the molecules in their mass available to other organisms like producers. Remember that while grass uses light energy from the sun to fuel its metabolism, it still needs molecules in order to build its structures. This comes from the air in the form of CO2, but can also come from other important elements like nitrogen. These elements are made available from decomposers like fungi. Energy is passed from individual to individual. But what this image doesn't show is that energy is also lost at every stage. So let's fix this and make it more accurate. A bulk of energy comes from the sun. Most of the sun's energy is reflected back into space and lost as heat energy. But some of that energy is used by grass to fuel growth. That energy is stored, and some of it is passed on to the grasshopper. Those primary consumers use some of that energy to fuel their metabolisms, and a lot of that energy is lost as heat. A secondary consumer will gain far less energy from a primary consumer than that primary consumer gained from the producer. Finally, the producer gains very little energy from things like fungi. It mostly gains essential nutrients it needs for growth, but not energy. That's because most of the energy has been lost through heat at every step in this process. The chemical energy that is gathered by producers like grass is then shared through chemical processes. These chemical reactions and chemical processes occur within organisms inside their cells. Together, all of the chemical reactions that take place inside the cells and inside organisms, including the processes that consume or generate energy, are referred to as a cell's metabolism. There are two kinds of metabolic pathways, anabolic and catabolic. Anabolic pathways are those that require energy to synthesize larger molecules. Catabolic pathways are those that generate energy by breaking down larger molecules. Both types of pathways are required for maintaining a cell's energy balance. A lot of the energy that we make is produced within an organelle called the mitochondria. Mitochondria were likely once free-living prokaryotes. They likely entered the cells of eukaryotes through a process known as endosymbiosis. Eukaryotic cells now use mitochondria to generate a lot of the energy that they use. Let's look at the mitochondria more closely. The mitochondria is an organelle that houses many of the reactions of cellular respiration. We call the fluid enclosed by the inner mitochondrial membrane the matrix, and this is the site of transition steps and the Krebs cycle. The inner mitochondrial membrane is the site of the electron transport chain and the synthesis of ATP using the enzyme ATP synthase. The intermembrane compartment is the space between the outer and inner membranes of the mitochondria. Another way to think of this is that the mitochondria is kind of like a battery. A battery has two different areas within it, a negative and a positive. Similarly, a mitochondria has two different spaces within it. The inner matrix, which is a fluid-filled space in the center of the mitochondria, and then another space called the inner membrane space. The inner membrane space occurs within the inner membrane and the outer membrane. Respiration occurs in three main steps: glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. We'll describe those briefly and then go into each one of those in more detail. Glycolysis is the breakdown of a 6-carbon sugar into 3 carbon molecules of pyruvate. This occurs inside the cell, but outside of the mitochondria. There's also the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. This cycle oxidizes pyruvate. Enzymes also rearrange atoms and bonds into ATP, NADH, and another electron carrier, FADH2. These are all important high-energy molecules. The third step in respiration is where a lot of ATP is produced. This is the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain transfers high-energy electrons from NADH and FADH2 through a series of membrane proteins to create a hydrogen ion gradient. Mitochondria use potential energy in this gradient to generate ATP using ATP synthase, which is an enzyme. Let's first look at glycolysis. Remember, this occurs outside of the mitochondria, but within the cell. Glycolysis uses one molecule of glucose to produce 2 molecules of pyruvate. There are 2 phases of glycolysis: the energy investment phase and the energy harvest phase. You can see that in the energy investment phase, ATP is used up. The 6-carbon molecule of glucose is broken up into 2 3-carbon sugars. Those 2 3-carbon sugars now undergo identical processes. They're shown here twice. You can look at either the top or bottom 3-carbon sugar and follow along. They both end up doing the same thing. The next phase is the energy harvest phase. This is where energy is gained from these 3-carbon molecules. You can see that NAD+ becomes a higher energy NADH molecule, and 2 ADPs are converted into 2 ATPs. Overall, 4 ATPs are produced during the energy harvest phase, and 2 molecules of NADH. The product pyruvate is important in the next stage. Here you can see one molecule of pyruvic acid loses a carbon atom. It's then combined with coenzyme A to produce a molecule of acetyl-CoA. This is a 2-carbon molecule that is important in the citric acid cycle. This process also generates NADH, which is a higher energy molecule. The next stage in respiration occurs within the mitochondria. This is the citric acid cycle, which is also known as the Krebs cycle. The citric acid cycle is a series of chemical reactions. Part of this cycle is considered an aerobic pathway, which means it requires oxygen. This is because the NADH and FADH2 produced must transfer their electrons to the next pathway in the system, which will use oxygen. If oxygen is not present, this won't occur. The 8 steps of the cycle are a series of chemical reactions that produce 2 carbon dioxide molecules, 1 ATP molecule, and reduced forms of NAD and FAD. These are important coenzymes in the cell. These higher energy molecules produced are important in facilitating the electron transport chain, where a bulk of ATP is produced. The next stage in respiration is the electron transport chain. As indicated in this diagram, a bulk of the ATP is produced during this process. Here's an illustration showing the process of the electron transport chain. There's a couple of different things going on here, but let's unpack this in a way that connects the concepts we learned in our last lecture. Remember, in our last lecture, we described chemical energy and the way that energy can be gathered from a difference in concentration across a membrane. Let's first look in the far right of this diagram. You can see that there's a mitochondria. The part of the mitochondria we're looking at is the inner membrane. That's the membrane that separates the matrix from the intermembrane space. Just like inside a battery, where a negative side and a positive side are separated, we see that the matrix is separated by the inner membrane space by the inner membrane. We can see that embedded on this inner membrane are protein complexes. Here they look purple. Now let's look at the full diagram. Remember where you are on the mitochondria. You're looking at the surface of the inner membrane. These protein complexes are touching both the inner matrix space and the inner membrane space. The next thing you should notice is that there's a high concentration of hydrogen ions in the inner membrane space, and there's a lower concentration of hydrogen ions in the matrix. Remember that when we had a difference of concentration of molecules, chemical energy always wanted to balance that concentration. Well, since there's a higher concentration of hydrogen ions in the inner membrane space, chemical energy wants to put those ions inside the matrix. The mitochondria uses this chemical energy to power an enzyme called ATP synthase. Let's start on the far left of this diagram. We can see that NADH, which was produced during the citric acid cycle, is reduced to NAD. In doing so, it loses an electron. That electron powers the first protein complex. That protein complex moves hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space. Remember that this is against the flow of chemical energy, but it can happen since it's powered by the electron. That electron continues to pass from one protein complex to the next. The next protein complex does the same thing. It moves a hydrogen ion into the inner membrane space. By the time the electron loses all of its useful energy, it's passed through several protein complexes, which have passed more hydrogen ions into the intermembrane space. This maintains a high concentration of hydrogen ions on one side of the inner mitochondrial membrane. The matrix has a lower concentration of hydrogen ions. Remember that chemical energy wants to move those hydrogen ions from the outside to the inside of the mitochondrial membrane. The only way for this to happen is through ATP synthase. You can think of ATP synthase like a wheel. As each hydrogen ion passes through, it turns that wheel. And when that wheel turns, it converts ADP to ATP, which is a high energy molecule. Another way to think of this is like a water wheel on a river. There's a river of hydrogen ions passing into the matrix, and as they pass ATP synthase turns and produces ATP. In this way, high energy molecules produced during the citric acid cycle are used to power a concentration gradient. That concentration gradient produces a bulk of ATP in respiration. Most of the foods we eat contain a mix of different macromolecules that are important in different stages in respiration. Here you can see that carbohydrates contribute to sugars that are used in glycolysis. The fats we eat contain glycerol and fatty acids, which are important to glycolysis and the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. The proteins in our food contain amino acids that are used in glycolysis, the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, and the citric acid cycle. All of these processes produce high-energy molecules that are used in the electron transport chain, where a bulk of ATP is produced.